And my name is Shelley Gehring, and I'm a Senior Program Manager at MHP, Mass Housing Partnership. We are a quasi-state agency in Massachusetts focused on increasing the supply of affordable housing across the state. This is the third session in our Affordable Housing Trust Fund and Community Preservation Act series that we're putting on this month. And today we're focused on bonding CPA funds, Community Preservation Act funds, to support affordable housing in your community. We have a few different speakers here with us. We're going to be starting with Stuart Saganour of the Community Preservation Coalition. And then we have, we're going to be highlighting a project in Orleans, the community of Orleans on the Cape. So we have the developer, Pennrose, Charlie Adams from Pennrose, who are focused on this particular development that we're looking at today. And then Scott Walker, the treasurer of Orleans, will be digging into some of the details of their bonding project. So Stuart is the executive director of the Community Preservation Coalition. He's been there since 2006. And the CPC functions similar to a trade association. So he supports the CPA communities all across Massachusetts. And he'll get in a little bit of the work that he does, I'm sure. But he also was the chair of the CPC in his home community on the North Shore from 2001 to 2007. And one year he overlapped with both of those. And so he had a huge dose of CPC that year. But I'm going to just turn it over to Stuart, and he's going to give us the overview, some broad information around using CPA to support housing projects.
Thank you, Shelley. And thanks for reminding me about my hell year where I did CPA day and night. I love CPA, but I would never recommend anyone do it all day for their day job and all night for fun. But I've been at the coalition since 2016, and this is one of my favorite topics to talk about ever since, because it's a incredibly powerful thing that you can do with your CPA funds in terms of bonding against your future revenue stream. And it has an advantage over the way a town normally has to bond with their money, because it doesn't have to go to the ballot. It just has to be approved at town meeting. So let's talk a little bit about what CPA has done in this category. And actually, I forgot I had this slide. I just wanted to quickly introduce you to our organization, the Community Preservation Coalition. We are a nonprofit based in Boston. I see a lot of our CPA friends on this webinar today. And we have a steering committee that is comprised of folks from different statewide organizations. And also we have 8 members from local community preservation committees across the state. We have some at-large members, and there are 21 folks who sit on our steering committee and guide the operations of the coalition. And the things we do are, I think, typical for any, for lack of a better term, municipal trade association. We do trainings like this one, conferences. We do a lot of work up on Beacon Hill to advance changes to CPA that would be beneficial to all the communities. We do tons of technical assistance by email and telephone. And we're just there really to support all the communities that have CPA and answer questions for all the communities who are interested in having CPA. By the way, you'll be interested to know that the number of communities that have really picked up on CPA over the past few years has increased. And we have 3 communities who are voting on CPA next month: Lakeville, Westminster, and Pepperell. And Westboro is voting in the fall, and probably 2 or 3 others will come on board for the fall as well. So people are still very interested in having CPA in their communities, and the ability to bond CPA funds is one of the reasons. This is a very, very popular part of our program. Almost 100 of our communities have bonded. We have 187 that have adopted CPA, so close to 100 have issued at least one bond. And many of them have issued multiple bonds, because you can see there's 100 communities or 98 communities, but 273 projects. That means communities have bonded 2, 3, sometimes 4 or 5 times over the course of their CPA program. As bonds get paid off, it frees up more capacity. And if the bonds are smaller, you can sometimes have 2 or 3 out at the same time. So it's incredibly popular. We're closing in on, I think this year, when the projects are reported, will be over $500 million in bonds that have been issued for CPA projects. The things that we see folks bond for most commonly are land acquisition, buying a piece of land for conservation, or buying a piece of land for parks, playgrounds, athletic fields, to a lesser extent, buying a historic building. We also see a lot of projects that restore historic buildings, existing historic buildings, town halls, libraries, even historic firehouses, all sorts of historic buildings. And it's so much less expensive to do a project like that all at once rather than doing it piecemeal over a number of years. And that's why we find top to bottom historic rehabilitation is a really popular use of CPA funds. The third most popular category is recreation. So bonding to build a park or a playground or a huge athletic complex. And probably part of the reason why Shelley chose this as a topic for today, housing is not as popular a project to bring up a bond for. And that's probably due to the fact that a lot of the projects are done, most of the projects are done by private developers, community development corporations, Habitat for Humanity, nonprofits, and commercial companies like Pennrose. So communities might be a little reluctant to bond for activities done by others, but it's clearly possible, and we're going to explain it today how to do that. And hopefully we'll see that number grow as time goes on. So when you issue a CPA bond, it is just like any other bond in most cases that the community might issue. It's a general obligation bond of that city or town, but you are promising to pay it back out of your future CPA revenue stream. Your city does it, your city or town does this all the time, and they're promising to pay back their bonds out of their regular general municipal revenue stream to buy a fire truck or build a new police station or do a major roadworks project. With CPA, you have two funding sources, right? You have your local funds in CPA communities, and then there's also matching funds that come from the state every year. While the matching funds are a terrific funding source for CPA, and they really are the magic of CPA and why it's so popular, you can't count on those matching funds to be at a specific level every year. So the CPA rules will not allow you to use that funding source, the state match, as a bonding source. So you can only bond what you can afford to pay back from your local revenue. An important consideration when you do a bond, and this is not just for CPA, but this is in the state bonding law, it does require a 2/3 vote at the legislative body. So if you're going to town meeting or the city council and the Community Preservation Committee has recommended bonding as the source, as the funding source for the project, you've got to be prepared that it's going to be a pretty popular project because 2/3 is sometimes tough to get. We have an entire history of projects that have fallen in that what I call the death zone between you get majority, but you pass 2/3. You get majority, but you fail to get 2/3. And if you have 60%, it's going to fail. That's considered a fail, even though the town is overwhelmingly supportive of it. So that's an important consideration when you choose bonding as a funding source for a project. And as I said before, most times when a municipality bonds against its revenue stream, it requires a legislative body vote, town meeting of the city council. And then most likely that bond is going to exceed the limits of Prop 2.5, and it's going to need to go to the ballot to be approved. And townspeople are going to have to vote on it at their spring election or one of the fall state elections. CPA does not require that step. You have already had your ballot election in a community, in a CPA community. The town has already been to the ballot and they've authorized your CPA revenue stream. If you have a 3% local surcharge, the town has authorized that 3% surcharge going forward, and you're just bonding against that previously authorized revenue. So you don't have to go back to the ballot. You've already had your ballot election. The town or city has already given you your local revenue, whether it be 1%, 1.5%, whatever it is in your community, and you're just bonding against that. So that's a really huge benefit of issuing a bond with CPA is it only requires the Community Preservation Committee recommendation and then the vote at the city council or town meeting. So if you are on a community preservation committee, and I know we have a lot of folks who are on this call today, it's important to stay on top of what your bond capacity could be. You know, what can we afford to do looking at our revenue for the next 10, 20, or even 30 years? And what kind of bond could we issue? How much bond capacity do we have? A community preservation committee is not going to be able to figure out this on their own. But your municipal officials know how to do this stuff. They bond all the time for all sorts of CPA projects. And Scott from Orleans is going to talk more about that today, because he's the guy who knows everything about bonding and prepares all those bonds in his community. So you'd want to go to someone like a Scott in your municipal finance department and ask them to prepare a spreadsheet that shows you how much capacity your CPA program has to bond in the future. So we have a simple one that we have on our website. Scott in Orleans did an even better version of it and improved upon the one we have, and we've already posted that to his website. We actually posted it last week, but I just asked him for permission to do it a couple minutes ago. So thankfully he said yes. We appreciate that, Scott. But it's a very simple spreadsheet. It would show what your estimated revenue is going to be in coming years. With CPA, you always have to reserve 10% for the other categories. So if you're going to do a housing bond, you need to account for 10% in future years for historic projects and 10% in open space projects. You're probably going to have an administrative account for the Community Preservation Committee. So in this example, of the $525,000 this community had in revenue, about $393,000 would be available to support a bond, but they already had a bond in this community. They had a debt service every year of $256,000. So what they had available for a new CPA bond in this community was $135,000 a year. So what will that buy you? Well, your finance folks can tell you. They work with bond counsel. They know what the current interest rates are, and they can project over, the life of the bond, whether it be a 10-year bond, a 20-year, or a 30-year, what size bond you could support for your $135,000 in this example that was available for debt service. And in this case, this community had capacity to take out almost a $1.8 million bond over 20 years at the then current interest rates. We'll probably be back at those rates now, but I think they are a little bit lower right now. And Scott probably knows more about that. And then they take that information and they can project it going, this shows 5 years into the future because that's all that would fit on the screen that you'd be able to see. But this spreadsheet actually goes out 20 years, showing you what the debt service would be each year and how much extra money you would have for other CPA projects going forward. So it's an important tool to have, and we definitely suggest that communities work with their municipal officials to update that, have one and update it every year so you know what your capacity is for as you consider what kind of projects to do with your CPA funding.
Are you on this webinar, or do you want to talk to me?
Okay, thank you for muting that. So how long can you go with a bond? Well, state law used to say only 20 years, but probably about 7 or 8 years ago, in an attempt to make bonds more affordable for communities, the state lengthened the maximum term to 30 years. There is a chart on the DOR website that shows all the different types of bonds communities can issue and what the maximum they can go to in terms of years. They're not going to let you bond 30 years if you're buying a police car, for example, because that car won't last 30 years. But most things that CPA could bond for, buying land, building hard assets, building housing, rehabbing historic buildings, almost all of those can go up to 30 years. And that can be very powerful because, over 30 years, it's going to be a small debt service payment every year, and you'll have other money for lots of other priorities. The downside being, of course, like your mortgage, the longer you go, the more interest you're going to pay over the course of that bond. So there's a sweet spot there, and your municipal financial officials can help you figure that out and advise you on that. We always caution that when a community preservation committee makes a recommendation to bond a project, they should nail down that term in their recommendation, because how long the bond goes can affect how much money you have for other projects. The CPC is in charge of their own budget, and they should be specifying the bond term so they know how much they're going to have to do other things in the future. All right, so there is obviously an article that goes in front of the council or town meeting when you are bonding after the CPC has recommended that funding source. And there are some important things to make sure that are in there. You definitely, if you're going to be using CPA money to pay back a bond, either in part or in full, you absolutely want to make sure that bond authorization at the legislative body says that Chapter 34B is the authorizing authority for that bond. 44B is the CPA chapter number, because unless the bond authorization passed at the legislative body and says it's being bonded under Chapter 44B, you will not be able to pay it back with CPA funds. So that's a critical thing. Obviously, you want to include the term of the bond that the CPC has recommended. And there's always costs to issue bonds too, and they can be a little bit high. You've got the rating agencies that have to rate the bond. You've got all sorts of closing costs and legal costs and bond issuance costs, and CPA can pay for that. In fact, you should if it's a CPA bond, because your town probably doesn't have $50,000 or a little more, a little less, whatever it might be, hanging around in the general fund. So you want to make sure to include that in the recommendation, not only the bond money for the project, but get an estimate of those miscellaneous costs and include that in your warrant article or your city council order. And if you have a project and you have some money in the bank in your CPA program, but not enough to pay for it all, it's okay to mix and marry funding sources. So if you need a $1 million bond and you have $500,000 you can put toward the project, you construct the project funding so that $500,000 comes from your existing CPA revenue, and $500,000 is issued as debt. As I mentioned, the 2/3 vote is critical, and that you don't need a ballot election. So these are kind of all the different things that are important to remember about your town meeting vote and the process afterwards. By the way, I'm showing you pictures of all great bonded projects, a lot of them municipal buildings. Upton Town Hall is amazing what they did there, the way they dug out their basement to give themselves an entire floor downstairs, and found this is a very historic building, found a boiler from like, the early 1900s or mid 1900s that had to be buried because it couldn't be taken out. And this is Gloucester City Hall here, which had a terrific CPA rehabilitation. So really some iconic buildings in the historic category have received CPA funding. All right, so other considerations as you move through the process, it is okay for a municipality to issue one bond that has a CPA project in it and a non-CPA project. So for example, in my community, in that one year when I was at the coalition as a director and also the chair of my CPC, we were buying a piece of open space at our Springtown meeting. But the town knew that they were going to go to fall town meeting with a proposal to bond for a new police station. So they waited to issue the bond until after that second vote, and both were combined in the same bond issuance, which can save costs and save time and energy. And then they just apportion out the debt service every year. If 30% of that total was for CPA, they charged that to the CPA budget, and 70% went to the police station budget as you were paying off the debt service every year. When you pay off that debt service, you're going to vote that at town meeting every single year, the annual debt service. When you bond against CPA, the legislative body can choose to fund a payment one year from another source. I don't think it's ever happened, and I can't see why communities would do that, but it is possible. But it doesn't work in reverse, and that's the reason we put this in here to illustrate it. If you have a bond that you've issued in the past and it wasn't issued under Chapter 44B, you can't use CPA money to pay back that bond, even if it was an eligible project. You bought a piece of open space 5 years before you had CPA, and you have a 20-year bond, and then you adopt CPA, and now you want to start paying that bond back with CPA money. That is not possible because the original bond wasn't issued under authority of Chapter 44B. For those CPA budget geeks that we have on the call, the requirement on CPA is you have to spend or reserve 10% of your annual revenue each year for each of the three categories. If you have a payment on a bond, on a housing bond or any category that is more than the 10% requirement for that category, that fulfills the 10% requirement. You do not have to then reserve an additional 10% on top of that. So to illustrate that, here's a community that had $525,000 in CPA revenue. So they had to put aside $52,500 in the historic and open space reserves. But their housing bond debt service that year was $135,000. That's way more than 10%. So they don't need to have a $52,000 going into a housing reserve account. That $135,000 payment fulfills the requirement for spending or reserving 10% of your funds for housing for that year. We get this question a lot, and it's important to, that everyone understand it, not just the CPC, but also the town officials and the proponents of a project, because usually the first time someone bonds in a community, or when a CPC bonds in a community for the first time, the question comes up, hey, CPA is not a permanent program. After you've been in CPA for 5 years, you can revoke the program. And people always are afraid that this would take away their right to revoke CPA if they have issued a 20-year bond to help out with a housing project. And that's not the case. You can still revoke CPA, even if you have outstanding bonds, but there's no free lunch, right? There has to be some provision made to pay back those bonds. At the time a community revoked with outstanding bonds, your municipal officials would add up how much money was sitting in the CPA program on that day. And if it was sufficient to pay off the rest of the bond, that's fine. The CPA surcharge would fall off the tax bills and you'd be considered a revoked community. But if there wasn't enough money in the account, then the CPA surcharge would have to continue for a period of time just to accrue enough money to pay off that bond. And you could put all the money at your current surcharge level, or you could get permission from DOR to reduce the CPA surcharge to exactly what you needed to pay back that bond every year. So reduce your 3% surcharge to 0.67%, because that's the amount of money you need to fund the debt service every year. I will say this, I wouldn't worry about it. It's never happened. We've never had a community revoke CPA so far, knock on wood, and let alone a community that had an outstanding bond. I don't know if that'll be true forever, but 20 years into the program, folks really like their CPA program, and we've never had anyone exit the program once they've adopted. So, Shelley, I'll turn it back to you. That's what I have. And we can do some questions. And then folks, if they think of something after the fact, give us a call or shoot us an email. Our website is communitypreservation.org, and Shelley's going to send out material afterwards with a copy of these slides and our contact information. So thanks for listening.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Stuart. That was a great overview of bonding with CPA funds. And I just want to direct you to all the guests to the chat that my colleague Emma did put the link to where you'll find these materials, not only the recording, but also the slides. You'll find it there on the housing toolbox. And I don't see any questions yet specifically around bonding, but if you do, please add those to the chat and we'll come back to them. So Stuart gave us the overview of bonding. Now we're going to shift to a case study. We're going to look at the Cape Cod 5 redevelopment project in Orleans on Cape Cod. And first, we're going to have Charlie Adams from Pennrose, who's the developer of this site, gives us an overview of the project. And just a bit of an introduction of Charlie. He is the regional vice president at Pennrose, a development firm. He's responsible for the execution and continued growth of Pennrose's development pipeline, including all aspects of the real estate development process, from initial conception through construction to lease up and stabilized occupancy or sale within the New England area. Charlie brings more than 20 years of experience to Pennrose in multifamily housing, including the origination, acquisition, financial analysis, underwriting, and syndication of low-income housing tax credit developments. He joined Pennrose in 2016 and has significant depth and diverse experience in the multifamily industry, with experience working for a housing authority as a syndicator and performing development responsibilities. So I'm going to turn it over to Charlie to take us through the project in Orleans.
Great. Thank you, Shelley. And I like to say that you said 20 years experience. I like to stick to that number as I get older. That's a good number to stick to. Frozen there in time. So thank you for having Pennrose on this. This is a great session. Getting a chance to talk with Stuart and Scott as getting ready for this was really great as well. So really some valuable stuff here for me as well. And I'm living through some of it, but there's a lot for me to learn as well. So this is really helpful. So thank you, MHP, for bringing us all together in this group. So as Shelley mentioned, we are doing a project using Cpa bonding money in the town of Orleans with Scott and the rest of the town. And it's the Cape Cod 5 Savings Bank. And I'm going to get into that in a little bit. First, I'll give you a little bit about who Pennrose is for those of you that don't know us. Pennrose is a 50-year-old developer. We are a developer of multifamily housing. We specialize in affordable and mixed income housing, although we will do some market rate. We do primarily affordable. Right now, over those 50 years, we've now gotten up to about 20 different states that we're in. We've done over 17,000 units in that period of time and over 260 developments, as you can see. As Shelley mentioned, I represent the New England office, so I basically oversee Pennrose's development operations from Connecticut up. So the bulk of our business right now is in Connecticut and Massachusetts, and we're starting to be active in Rhode Island and looking to get involved in some of the other New England states as well. I've been with Pennrose, as Shelley mentioned, since 2016, but as Shelley was kind to say, 20 years in the business. I have worked for a number of different groups, including the Cambridge Housing Authority. So Steve Swanger, it's nice to see you on the screen. It's a blast from the past. I started there and then worked for a syndicator for a while, and then back in the development side. So I've gone back and forth from development to financing, and now back in development. I throw this slide up here just to say, these are our core values, but the reason I sort of throw this in here too is the key focus is collaboration. And I think this deal in particular shows a level of collaboration that really is unique and significant and is sort of maybe the pinnacle of collaboration that we did with the town of Orleans, which is just
Charlie, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we are not seeing your slides. Do you mind sharing?
Oh, you're not seeing the slides? Oh, shoot. Well, that's not good. Thank you. I feel like I should have, what happened here? Back here. Okay, let me try this again. So share screen. Oh boy. This is what I was afraid of. I just had it open before.
You just had it open with us.
I know. Oh boy. Let me try this here. Okay, try this now. Go back to the screen. How are we doing now? That should work, I think.
Yeah, great. And then if you'll just do the slideshows. Yep, great, fantastic.
Yep.
All set.
Right. Okay. So there are the numbers. Here's the collaboration. We'll skip right here. All right. So, so you didn't miss much in terms of visuals. It was more about what I was saying. So a little bit about the Cape Cod 5 site. So this is the Cape Cod 5, obviously the bank on the Cape. It was their operations facility, and it became available. And I'll get a little bit into that process. But basically, the development concept we have here is an adaptive reuse of a vacant property that's how we would classify it. So we actually are taking this existing facility and converting it into housing. We're adding on to it, and we're creating some freestanding units as well that you'll see. So the parcel is actually two parcels that the Cape Cod 5 Savings Bank own together. And they have, as I mentioned, they've just recently vacated their operations and moved to another location. But this is right in the heart of downtown Orleans. It's an original 1970s building. And, not all buildings are convertible to, not all commercial buildings are convertible to residential. This one lended itself extremely well to it. We basically were able to take the existing building and lay out a total of, 52 units in this building when you add on the addition. But it was very user-friendly to convert to housing. So our total plan is a total of 62 units, 54 in the main building, and that includes the existing buildings there, plus an addition that we're adding on to in an L-shaped pattern. And then we have 2 freestanding modules of 4 units each that are townhome style buildings that are located on the site. Our plan here is to do all of the units as affordable. The vast majority will be for what we call LIHTC eligible funding under 60% of area median income. And the balance of 10 units would be workforce, which basically goes up to 120% of the area median income. So all the units in this development will in fact be deed restricted. And you can see the breakdown on the right-hand side between 1s, 2s, and 3 bedrooms. So here's the site plan that our architects were able to come up with some landscaping designs. It's a fairly tight site, but it has this beautiful boulevard that comes into it, if you can see on the right-hand side of the drawing. And we really wanted to keep that, that element to the design. So we really worked hard with the architects that was a key design feature, and to design around that. So as you can see, the existing building here, you can kind of see there's a black outline, and then the L to the left is where we're adding on, get up to the total of 52 units. And we also, we wanted to get over the, get over a 62 unit count. For us, economies of scale, for us to be able to operate these facilities efficiently and to be able to have a full-time manager on site, we really need to be, over the 60 unit threshold. So we were able to create those townhomes on the site, which added additional 8 units. The other benefit of those was we actually created 3-bedroom units there, which we couldn't create in the existing building. So there actually is some great units for some families in the community, which is a big need for the Cape. So here's a little bit what it looks like. You really can't tell where the existing building stops and the new addition ends. That was, obviously intentional. Our architect did a great job of blending it together, so it looks like, just one building from the beginning. We're really not doing too much to the outside in terms of changing it. We're going to fix it, but it'll basically resemble what was there in the past, and we think that that's good for the community. It's not a historic asset, but it has been there for a while, and it's nice to be able to sort of preserve that in a sort of a historically sensitive way. This is what the townhomes look like. Basically, it's 3 stories, but it's duplexes over flats in some cases, and in some cases it's all 3 stories for a 3-bedroom unit, and in some cases there's a 3-bedroom unit that's on the ground floor that's accessible, because we're doing accessible units of each kind, 1s, 2s, and 3s, I should say. The other important design feature for this is that it's mostly a zero entry building, where you go right into to the ground floor and don't have any steps to make it more accessible. So here's the fun part in terms of this is, so the focus of this meeting is sort of more about the numbers and the financing than perhaps the design. This is obviously a project we're going in for low-income housing tax credits. And it takes obviously a village to create to the funding here. The big number that you see here on here that in the sources is the Orleans CPC and Outer Cape funding line of $2.5 million. That obviously would not be possible without this bonding. That number, obviously the vast majority of that number comes from the town of Orleans itself. That's the $2 million number. One of the differentiating principles about this project, and why sort of talk about the collaboration, is this actually was not an RFP that the town put out. This is actually it's private land that Pennrose entered into a purchase and sale with the Cape Cod 5 Savings Bank, who's been a really great partner, by the way, I should say. And we negotiated a sale with them. They were actually discounted the value to be able to achieve some affordable housing here with us, which was great. But there still is a real value to acquiring the building, which you don't typically have in a lot of developments that you guys may be familiar with. A lot of towns put out their own land. And it's often at no development cost. So here, we worked with the town to say, hey, we really want to do this, and the town was actually way ahead of us, which I'll get into in a little bit in terms of wanting this to happen here. But because the costs here are going to be higher than they might be at other locations, because we've got this additional acquisition value that's been added to the cost, that it was important that we get some larger CPA money for this type of project. And really the only way to do that was bonding. And it's been a great process with Orleans. They're the ones that took the lead on it. And it's been a very smooth and easy process to go through with them in terms of getting these funds allocated. Want to get a little bit off course a little bit. We'll come back to that. But I think the thing that's really valuable about this particular project that we're really excited about is that all of Orleans' neighbors have been supporting them in this project. This is something you really don't see in a lot of developments, where other towns will actually contribute money to the development on the site. They realize the value of having an asset in the town of Orleans that is a regional asset for the entire Cape. And so all of these towns have pledged this amount of support. Some have already been approved at town meeting. Some will need to be approved this year coming up at town meeting. And the one town that's not on here is Wellfleet, and they just didn't have enough funds this year, and they have asked us to come back next year and would reconsider a request for them. So we are just so excited about the support that the surrounding communities have given to this project as well. And it's been very beneficial, and we wouldn't be able to be moving forward on it if it wasn't for that. There was a slide I think I skipped in here when I went the transition. I wanted to talk a little bit about the collaboration with the town. I think I skipped right over it, if you can bear with me. Oh, maybe it didn't make it into this one. Oh, I think I grabbed the wrong one. Well, so let me, I will stop sharing and I'll just say this. The other process behind this, and why this was such a collaborative process, is the town of Orleans had identified this asset many years ago, and had done through a number of community engagement process. They put together a committee, they studied the site, they had community meetings about it, they hired an architect and other engineers to evaluate the site, and let Cape Cod 5 know that if they vacated the site, they'd be very interested in seeing the bank work with someone who would be able to provide affordable housing. And the bank was very supportive of that, and actually followed through on that. So we had already been out doing some work in Eastham on previous to this location. We have a site that's 65 units in Eastham, and the folks in Orleans saw that, were interested in that, and we were following along what was happening in the town, Orleans, with this Cape Cod 5 Savings Bank, and we reached out to Cape Cod 5 Savings to see if they'd be interested in working with us to acquire it, and that's how it all came to be. And so, it really we wouldn't be here if it wasn't the work that the town of Orleans had done previously on identifying this as a particular asset where affordable housing could work. We wouldn't be here if the Cape Cod 5 Savings Bank wasn't amenable to that as a reuse of their building for the community. It shows what a great community partner they are. And then, of course, the support that we've gotten from the selectmen, from the Affordable Housing Trust, from Scott and his team on being able to bring $2 million into a deal that, essentially dwarfs, annual contributions that most towns can do. We use CPA money a lot, and, we come in for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, and that's about as much as an individual town can do. Here to do $2 million, is possible, really because of the bonding capacity, and it's just been a great vehicle. And I, really would encourage you all, as you're thinking about your planning, to really consider the benefits that the leverage that you get with bonding projects like this. It just wouldn't be possible without it. So I will stop there if there are any questions.
Yeah, thank you, Charlie. That was fantastic, and that's a nice segue into a question from one of my colleagues. The $2 million, that amount. Was that amount driven by the development budget deficit, or was it the amount that the town just agreed to up front? How did you come to the 2 million amount?
Yeah, very good question. So it essentially was budget driven. When we put the deal together and we added in the acquisition cost, we looked at the available sources that we thought we could get. and realized that, the gap was about 2 million that we needed. It was 2 million at the time. We've gone out and got a little bit more money from the surrounding towns. So now we have, $2.5 million of dollars. But at the time, we felt that 2 million was the gap that we had. And that's what we went into to the town of Orleans. We put before the CPA committee. We actually put it out there, and it was their idea to turn around and bond it. So I got to give full credit to them. We didn't come in and say, hey, why don't you bond this and get us this money? They figured out that the best way to do it was really to bond it. We knew we needed that kind of money. We asked for that kind of money, and they said, okay. And then they figured out how to do it. So it really was budget driven. It was a gap.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. And there was a question that you ended up answering at the end of how did you come to this site? Did Cape Cod 5 reach out to you, or did you reach out to them? So it was really that Pennrose reached out to Cape Cod 5.
Yes. Yeah. No, we were hearing that this was something that the town was interested in doing, and we reached out to the bank directly and said, hey, we read in the paper that this is something that is interested in. We do this kind of stuff. Would you consider selling to us? And then once we had under agreement, we turned to the town and said, hey, we want to turn this into affordable housing, and then we went from there.
Fantastic. Then there was a question that came into me privately of just wondering, when Pennrose approached the site and the existing building, what are the key things that you look at when you consider whether you can reuse a building versus needing to tear it down?
Great question. Great question. Windows is the first thing you look at. So you first look at the windows, right? Particularly if it's a historic building, right? You're looking at the windows. This wasn't necessarily a historic building in the sense that we would have to preserve it, but we wanted to preserve it. We didn't want to tear it down. So, and we didn't want to make substantial changes to the facade. So you really look at the windows and get a sense of, okay, are the windows the right, are there enough windows to convert into residential? Are they the right size and, for human occupancy, for residential occupancy? That's the first thing. And then the second thing you look at is the floor plan to see if you can really kind of get like a double loaded corridor configuration through the building. That's the most efficient. And then the third piece, once you sort of check those two boxes, then you actually get in and look at the type of material that the building is constructed out to see how, if it's serious, concrete, it's going to be more difficult to, make the changes we want to make. So those are those three things in order. First, the windows, then the floor plan, and then what is the material that it's made out of? And if it's wood, or then it's easier to reconfigure for residential. Great question.
Fantastic, thank you. And I'm wondering if Stuart can jump in. There's a question just asking about, is it wise to limit the annual bond service number to the expected 10% housing portion? And do you have a reaction to that, Stuart?
Well, I would say definitely not. The 10% rule is just there to give communities some momentum for all the categories. To let them know you can't pass CPA and ignore certain categories. But I do think a lot of folks look at that number and say, oh, that's what we should be doing, for a particular category. And it's just, there to make sure that you do something in all the different categories for your CPA program, for the quality of life in your community. So it really is not a number that you should figure in when a project comes to you. If you need less than 10%, you'll put some in the reserve account to fulfill the requirement. If the project needs more than 10%, you do what's needed. So I think it's really an immaterial number when you're looking at a request for funding. It's really, how does this request fit into our goals for the community and for our CPA program? And particularly with housing, what does the developer need to make this happen? It's great to say, oh yeah, we'll give you our 10%. But if then that's not enough and the numbers don't work on the program, what's the good of that? Because the project's not going to happen. So that really is not a number that really should factor into consideration when you have a project in front of you.
Thank you. And back to Charlie, someone has asked if Pennrose develops age-restricted housing as well as non-age restricted housing.
So my line has been, we can bring a Cape Cod 5 savings bank to a neighborhood just like yours, right? So we do new construction. We do adaptive reuse. We do a lot of historic renovation. That's been a major, we're focused on that a lot right now in Massachusetts. And we do family as well as age restricted. Yes, we do both.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So I'm not seeing any other questions, I don't think, right now. So we're going to shift over to Scott, who is the treasurer in Orleans, and he's going to get into the details, but just a little bit more about Scott before he gets going. He is the treasurer in Orleans. He's involved in public finance, cash management, taxation, revenue collection for this seaside community of about 6,000 individuals on the Cape. He's involved in Orleans issuance of a variety of municipal debt over the past 6 years on 5 different occasions. And Orleans bond rating is, I think the way you say it out loud is AAA rating by Standard & Poor's. And he also brings 18 years of experience as a financial advisor and 11 years in investment banking. So we're going to ask Scott to dig into the details for us, please.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So we're talking about bonding or borrowing money. A bond is in essence a loan that's repaid. And Charlie is correct. We saw the Cape Cod 5 banking headquarters as a potential site for affordable housing. We do have an affordable housing trust here in town that sort of targeted that property as an opportunity and approached developers. Charlie's company came forward, and by the time the Cape Cod 5 was ready to actually sell the property, we had a lot of the wheels already in motion. And as Charlie said, they came to us and said, we would like to see some sort of a commitment from the town. The $2 million was the figure for that purpose. And rather than try to finance or bond the entire $29 million project and do it ourselves, what the $2 million buys for us is a deed restriction in perpetuity that the affordable housing units will remain affordable as per local guidelines for income for the tenants. We did some math to see if this deed restriction did in fact make sense financially. The difference in value derived from rents between an affordable housing unit and a market rate housing unit times the number of units involved did in fact cover the $2 million cost. So the next step is, how do we borrow the money? How do we go to town meeting? How do we sell the idea? We have to come up with a warrant article. And I'm going to share a screen here. Tell me if this works. Looks like it does. So I have the text of our warrant article we used for this. As Stuart mentioned.
Could you zoom in a little bit so the text is larger? Thanks.
We have down here the stipulation that it's a 2/3 vote required. Doesn't require a ballot question when you're utilizing community preservation fund monies with the chapter 44B reference that Stuart mentioned. I'll move down to the summary of the motion, where in fact it spells out we're bonding to purchase an affordable housing restriction for 52 of the 62 units in the former Cape Cod 5 Operations Center. All of them qualify as affordable, a certain amount at an income threshold of 80% of area median income, another 10 units at no greater than 120% of the AMI. Tells a little bit about the project, tells a little about the per unit value of the affordability restriction. The town will obtain the deed restrictions, making the funds available. Again, the key point here, as Stuart mentioned, these CPC or CPA funds have already been raised in the tax base. And if you are a member of an affordable housing trust, this is a key point. Approval of the article or the borrowing will not increase property taxes. You've already received the money in your tax rate. You're going to town meeting and saying, we would like approval to now spend it in this fashion. So by borrowing the funds is the way that we're able to come up with the $2 million for the project. We could pay it off over 10 years. We could pay it off over 20 years. We could pay it off over 30 years, and decisions need to be made in that regard. The next step is to take the proposal to bond counsel. which is generally a large legal firm in Boston that looks at the project, looks at the requirements, and makes a decision as to whether we can legally borrow for the project. And they asked us 5 questions. Might the project otherwise exclusively be committed or sold to a third party? The answer was no. They need a certified copy of the vote or the report from the Community Preservation Committee showing that they approved or recommended the approval of the borrowing. Generally, your CPC committee is going to vote for any expenditures they made, but this is a necessary requirement. Number 3, as treasurer, I have to show them the projected debt service on this borrowing. I have to give them a breakdown of projected debt service on all other Community Preservation Act debt. And we have to give it an estimate of the amount of annual surcharge receipts that we will receive from community preservation, which is part of the budgeting process. That would be a known figure. The 4th item they require is an independent appraisal of the property, which we had done. This would probably be an expense borne by either your local affordable housing trust or perhaps your Community Preservation Act funding, one or the other. I don't recall if the appraisal here might have been something Charlie and Pennrose did. I have a copy of it. I'm not sure who did that. Then a certified copy of any leases, contracts, or other arrangements with third parties for management and operation of the facility. We don't have a contract in place yet. We will eventually. And that's what you tell your bond counsel. They then sign off on these requirements, give it a green stamp, if you will, and then we're free to go into the marketplace through a bidding process and issue the bonds. Now, Stuart mentioned, and this is a strategy we often employ here, of combining the bonding for your CPC projects with other bonding throughout the town. And there are large economies of scale that the CPC will be the beneficiary of if you sort of piggyback on other borrowing that the town will undertake. And this is a bond issue that we came to market with in December. The town borrowed $11.5 million on a general obligation municipal bond for about 10 different capital improvement projects. A piece of this 11 million was a portion of the $2 million in question. Now, where this affordable housing restriction is not deemed to be borrowing for general municipal purposes, in other words, those that benefit the entire town directly, this type of borrowing for an affordable housing restriction must be issued as a taxable bond issuance. Most municipal debt is tax exempt. And as a taxable bond issuance, we learned that by combining it with our other tax-free bonds, there was a limit to how much of the debt we could issue in year 1. That number was 1.3 million. The remaining $700,000 balance we will issue next year when we come to market again. At the time we prepared our issuance, we were told the earliest we may need these funds would be this upcoming September. We will internally borrow the $700,000 balance at that point if we need to do so, and then permanently bond it within a couple of months of that date. So your debt schedule shows you your principal and your interest payments per year going forward for 20 years. I lopped off the middle years because they become redundant. I've got the start and I've got the ending point. There are 2 ways you can borrow. You're most familiar with a consumer loan, an auto loan, or a home mortgage, whereby your yearly payments of principal and interest are identical. Here they are not. You see each yearly amount declining. The reason being is that in the municipal realm, we could borrow much like your mortgage, where all of these payments are equal, or we could borrow under a debt schedule known as a declining debt, where the numbers decline each year. Well, why would we want to do that? There's a couple of reasons why I think it's advantageous in this arena to do that. Under a declining debt schedule, What does remain constant is the amount of principal paid each year. If you look at your car loan or you look at your mortgage loans, you will see that in the early years, very little principal is paid and a lot of interest is paid. And as you get to the end of that type of a loan, where you're near paying it off, there are large principal payments and small interest payments. With this sort of a debt structure, the principal remains even. Most, or a larger percentage, I should say, is paid off in the early years. Benefit number one, over the life of the loan, the entire 20 years in this case, you'll incur less interest on a declining debt schedule than you would on a what is known as level debt schedule, like your mortgage or your car payment, where you're paying the same amount. Also, you'll be able to, as Stuart mentioned, achieve what we call increased debt capacity as the loan is paid off. In year one, the cost is $118,000 per year. In year six, it's $25,000 less at $93,000, and so on and so forth as we continue on. Now you've increased your capacity by $25,000 here versus your debt service figure in year one. This is what is known as debt drop-off. If you have other projects coming down the pipeline, it makes capacity available to you. So these are the two advantages in using a declining debt schedule. My third slide shows some of the advantages and disadvantages of a declining debt schedule and a level debt schedule. Declining debt allows more principal repaid in earlier years, allows increased borrowing capacity to occur sooner, incurs the least amount of total interest. However, if for your affordable housing trust and your community preservation committee, borrowing or bonding is a relatively new activity you wish to undertake, you may want to consider a level debt schedule for this reason. Paying an equal amount of principal and interest every year is a lot easier for the members of your committee to grasp, and it's easier for you to explain for budgeting purposes. It does incur a greater amount of total interest paid over the course of time, as would a schedule if you borrowed over 10 years instead of 20. If you borrowed over 30 years, that would be your largest interest component. These are also factors to consider. But I think in trying to sell the idea of borrowing money for these purposes, maybe your first go around a level debt schedule might be a wise idea. When we talk about capacity, we have a situation here. If we were to multiply this debt service times 10, one could say that, for example, in Orleans, we have roughly $1.2 million coming in each year in CPA surcharges, roughly 10 times this figure. If we were to bond all of it, all of the surcharge amount, and borrow 10 times this amount, that would mean we'd have capacity to finance $13 million, or 10 times this amount, in projects. Obviously, I don't believe there's any CPA committee or fund throughout the state that has that kind of money that they could dole out in cash for projects every year. So this will show you the kind of leverage you can achieve by borrowing instead of cash grants. I like to call these loan grants. You are granting money for CPC purposes through a loan as opposed to a cash grant. So these slides will be up and available. Other borrowing can be done on top of this. By combining it with the town, you're saving on issuance costs that Stuart talked about. To issue this as a standalone debt piece, 1.3 million or 2 million, is rather cost prohibitive. The cost to issue this bond divided by the dozen projects and everyone pays a pro rata amount is a much smarter way to go. And I think those are most of the points that I want to make. We have some questions there, Shelley, perhaps.
So I'm not actually seeing any specific to bonding, although I just want to let folks know to please put any questions specifically around bonding in the chat. But there are a couple of things that have come up that I want to bring forward and include Charlie in this. So one is, a question was asked about the subsidized housing inventory, and how Charlie showed us that multiple Cape communities are contributing to this development in Orleans, even though it's only, of course, located in Orleans. And the question was, do these other communities get any credit for these units on the state subsidized housing inventory? And the answer is no. The state does not give these other communities any credit on the SHI. And I think it underlines the significance of these contributions on the Cape. And this is not the first housing development on the Cape that has collected contributions from multiple communities. This is one of several actually at this point. I don't know if Charlie wants to speak any more to that, but he did talk about the way that the Cape sees the regional impacts, but I just want to ask Charlie if he wants to comment on this a little more.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thanks for that, because there is more to say on this. Besides the regional aspect that the communities get from that, the other thing that I think people on the Cape get this, really, really well, this idea that the regional housing is a model, but what they also get is that in these communities, you're not going to get a 50 or 60 unit deal coming through your town every year, right? And so when that does come through, you want the help and support of the other communities. So when we did the Village at Nauset Green in Eastham, we actually reached out to a couple of towns, and both Orleans and Wellfleet contributed $100,000 there to the work that we were doing in Eastham. And so when it was Orleans' turn to have a project, the first community that gave $100,000 was Eastham. Right. So there's this feeling of like, that if you contribute to other towns, when it's your turn and you have a large project, you need help, those other towns are going to be there to help you. And I think it's almost kind of an extension of this whole bonding capacity, right? You're kind of leveraging your money collectively with the communities around you, wherever you are, whether you're in the Berkshires or different parts of the state, that you could use those monies collectively on a regional housing concept that would benefit you either immediately with people that that work in your town and live in other towns, or when it's your turn to have a big project, those other towns will be there for you. I think that was, I think, one of the other takeaways that these towns got and why they supported. And, quite frankly, also, the state looks really favorably on that. And so when you have projects that are coming through for, tax credits, they're going to see that your community gave to other communities, and that has real value.
Fantastic. There was another question around the person used the term preferential lease, which I don't think that having a preferential lease would be legal at all under the Federal Fair Housing Act, but there's something that we call local preference in Massachusetts. And so the state will at times allow up to 70% local preference in an affordable housing deal. And Charlie did respond to this in the chat, if you want to refer to that. The state only allows this in the initial lease up of a development. And Charlie, I don't know, has Orleans requested local preference? Has that been discussed yet?
Yeah, so we are going to pursue the 70%. We haven't gotten notified that we have got it. We haven't really pushed. Once we get the funding in place, then we'll ask. More specifically, we got it in Eastham. We did work out in Auburn. We got a 70% preference there, so I'm fairly confident we'll get the same thing here. What the town would be willing to do, and what we did, in Eastham was, again, getting back at this, you don't get credit on the SHI, but what we were able to do in Eastham was get a 65% preference for Eastham residents and a 10% preference for all of the Cape. And so that was, even though you didn't get SHI credit, the state was willing to do that in that location. Now, that's all about facts and circumstances. It's not a guarantee that would happen everywhere, but that's something we would ask for as well to benefit those other communities.
Thank you. And I'm wondering if you, Charlie, and Scott can reiterate the role that the Affordable Housing Trust played in this particular development in Orleans.
Do you want to start, Scott?
Yeah, certainly. We have a program in town where there is a yearly appropriation of $275,000 made to the Affordable Housing Trust. Their goal is to generate 100 affordable units within a given period of time. I believe it's a 10-year plan, if you will. And they're constantly, they've got their ears and noses to the ground trying to find, overhear a conversation of someone who may be selling a property or has land available or something that may come up that's to their advantage that we might partner with a developer on, or something that they can move on themselves. One of the ideas is to purchase condominium properties in town, purchase an affordable restriction that it be deed restricted in perpetuity, much like this project, and then resell the unit in the marketplace. There's been limited success there. They've sort of opened their scope to larger projects such as this, which I mentioned had been on their radar screen for some time prior to its abandonment, if you will, or closure as a headquarters for a bank.
And I would add that in terms of, add to that, you know, the Affordable Housing Trust folks were like the foot soldiers here for this development too, right? So even though it was CPC, like they were the ones that were behind it. They helped, you know, advocate for it. They helped at town meeting. They did outreach to folks before town meeting, you know, just to get the word out to say this is something that's important. And so, you know, town meeting passed with flying colors. It was, I think maybe 2 people got up during town meeting and said something, and one was, and half of them were positive, right? So it was pretty remarkable the work that they did to get this to go forward, because you know, $2 million is a lot of money.
Yeah, that's an important point Charlie made. The town fortunately has been the citizens behind affordable housing. They see a need for it. They support it. They support it at town meeting, and that's very helpful. Without community support, we might be in a different scenario.
Thank you. And in fact, that leads to another question. If Stuart can jump in, that question of have any CPA bonding measures failed at town meeting? Have you seen that? You're muted.
Thank you, Shelley. I don't know the answer to that question. I would say that the success ratio of CPA projects that go to the legislative body, town meeting, or the city council is really high. I know anecdotally, I remember communities telling me all the time, we've never had a CPA project turned down at town meeting or at the city council. But I don't have any specific data, unfortunately, on bonded projects. But I know there have been certainly housing proposals that have failed at town meeting. We all know the tricky politics around housing, and that's why we're all working so hard to do things like what's happening in Orleans. But I don't know the answer to that question specifically. I guess there are probably very few that have failed.
Thank you. And Scott, someone is asking about how have the rating agencies treated this bonding?
Well, this bonding is a general obligation of the town of Orleans. It carries the AAA rating of the town. And in fact, although it is secured by a dedicated revenue stream, i.e. the surcharge receipts from the Community Preservation Act. As Stuart said, if something which has never occurred did occur and the town rescinded the CPA program, it falls as a general obligation of the town backed by the full faith and credit. The debt wouldn't go away. The town would have to come up with a way to assume the debt through their general fund, but it does carry, and it is on parity with the town's general obligation.
Fantastic, thank you. And there is a question around more specific around the subsidized housing inventory and projects counting or not. And we're actually not going to get into the ins and outs of that. That's a different topic. Does anyone else have any questions for our guests here? You're at this point, you can raise your hand if you want. But we do have a couple more minutes if someone has another question. Okay, something else. So there's a question coming in.
I can try that one.
Yeah, can you do that? Yeah, that'd be great.
And maybe Scott can comment on it too. So the question is, you have obligated yourself to pay this bond back for 20 years, but you do have to bring that as part of the CPA budget every year to town meeting to get town meeting to approve all the expenses of CPA and the CPA budget. And I do get that question a lot. It's like, well, what happens if town meeting turns down that debt service payment? And that has never happened that I know of. When I once asked the Department of Revenue about this question, they said, well, it's sort of a pro forma thing that you're bringing it to town meeting. You know, you're getting authority to include it in the CPA budget. But when the town voted to undertake that obligation, that 20-year, that initial vote, or for the bond authorization, they are then obligating themselves to the payback. So, you know, there's not a situation where there can't be a situation where the town is sitting there with 16 years left and town meeting is not giving approval, and then they're defaulting on that bond. But Scott, you can probably give a more technical answer to that.
Yeah, I know in our community, the CPC submits their spending or appropriation budget each year. There are cash grants in it, $50,000 to rebuild a steeple on a historical church, $40,000 to build a skate park. We'll pay cash for that. So they have a number of cash projects. Last year, they totaled $450,000. Plus, in the same budget request is $318,000 for existing open space debt service payments. And now this year, an additional sum for affordable housing debt payments. They're all combined as one budget figure. So I couldn't see at town hall, they'd say, yeah, we're going to approve all budget items except this one borrowing. It's either an all or none proposal. And I think as Stuart said, the town meeting vote to authorize the borrowing is the done deal. I don't see legally how they can go back on that. Not an attorney, but that's the best I could tell you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Sorry that I was misunderstanding the gist of that. So we are going to wrap up. We're at that time. And I want to thank Charlie, Scott, and Stuart for being here and for sharing with all of us how we can be bonding CPA funds for housing. And this is the third session. We have one more session coming up next week. In this series, we're going to be looking at affordable housing trusts. And this is really a 101. It's a basic, it's geared towards new trustees of affordable housing trust funds, as well as communities that are considering creating a trust. And we'll go through some of the requirements under the statute and some best practices, as well as the kinds of activities that a trust can be engaged in. So we hope you'll join us again next week. And this series will be posted, this session will be posted on the Housing Toolbox, and hopefully you got that link in the chat. And again, thanks everyone for being here. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Shelley.